Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sally Davies, writer and editor, and it is my pleasure to host today's Brochet Meetup, exploring one of the most pressing challenges facing public health and medicine today, the complex relationship between disinformation, trust, and healthcare. The COVID-19 pandemic and the recent re-election of Trump to the US presidency have brought these issues into stark relief. But as our panelists will discuss today, these challenges run much deeper and broader than any single crisis. We find ourselves at a critical historical juncture where declining trust in scientific institutions has intersected with the rapid spread of misinformation, affecting everything from routine vaccination to basic medical care. Yet this isn't a simple story of good information versus bad information. We want citizens who can think independently and critically evaluate claims, yet we also need them to be able to trust scientific consensus on crucial issues. This dilemma raises challenging questions about authority, democracy, and the very nature of expertise in our modern information landscape. So I'm looking forward to unpacking this with our panel today. Normally, these meetups run for about 50 minutes, but because this is such a rich and timely subject, we're going to allow it to run a little bit past the hour. So to those of you attending as audience members, please do drop questions in the chat, and the panelists and myself will try to pick those up and respond to them in the course of our conversation. So we very much look forward to your thoughts. I'm going to take this moment now to bring our panelists in and introduce themselves. So if each one of you could just introduce yourself and perhaps make a few comments on your particular area of interest within this subject. So I'm just going to go around based on who's on my screen. So Ruth, I'll start with you.
All right. Well, what I'm going to focus on today, and it's a huge topic, but I'm going to narrow it down, is social media and paid influencers. That is, I never heard the word influencer until this started, and now we've got influencers. So among the topics, and I'm just going to give a few, I want to give a highlight examples, not give an analysis, but just the highlight examples. That social media has been found to be a contributor to problems of mental and physical health, especially of teenagers. So I'm going to focus a little bit on children and teenagers. And I guess to whet everyone's appetite, I want to name 3 examples of what showed up on social media directed at children and teens. First of all, on Instagram, there was a jewelry ad that drew solicitations for sex with a 5-year-old. That is to say, a girl was shown, this was a jewelry ad, a little girl was shown wearing a sparkly charm. The jewelry maker discovered that almost all the readers of this particular ad were adult men, including sex offenders, that is, people who had already been charged with sex offense. And 2 of the sex offenders offered to pay the child for sexual acts. All right, that was just one example of what showed up. A second one, and I love the title here, a marketplace. This was an example that showed up in the media. A marketplace of girl influencers managed by moms and stalked by men. And this was another example of predatory behavior. That was the article. The death of a 10-year-old girl was watching videos on TikTok. So I've already mentioned Instagram, and now we have TikTok. The algorithm used by the program provided a video that was termed a blackout challenge. And what the challenge prompted viewers to do was a type of self-asphyxiation and record themselves in the process. This 10-year-old tried the challenge and accidentally hanged herself and died. And a subsequent article in the New York Times said that the same blackout challenge was linked to 15 deaths of children 12 years old and younger in an 18-month period. So those are my examples for adults and for children and adolescents. And my final point here, or example, is a video on TikTok that encouraged people to drink borax. Now, for those of you in the audience who don't know what borax is, it was in the United States sold as a laundry detergent. So a TikTok user, this was a chemical compound of the borax, and the TikTok user encouraged people to drink borax. He had 47,000 followers on his TikTok account, and he told them to make a solution of borax and water to drink daily with their morning coffee. And his video had more than 34 million views. Well, that's the end of my examples. And my concluding thought here is that there are many barriers in the United States to controlling social media, barriers that do not exist in other countries. And in this kind of the United States, it turns out to be the First Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees free speech. So I'll leave it to my colleagues here to come up with some cures or some solutions to this problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And just to clarify as well, Ruth is the Distinguished University Professor Emerita at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in Bronx, New York. Very interested to unpack this with you, Ruth. I mean, I'm even asking, like, do we even need the worries about the First Amendment when the social media companies themselves are resiling from doing fact checking, which will be an interesting conversation. So we'll return to this. Just quickly, because I can see a question here from one of the participants. This meetup will be recorded, so it will be possible for those of you or colleagues who can't attend to hear what we have to say. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to bring you in, Laurie, now, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and talking about your area of interest.
So I'm Laurie Zoloth, and I teach at the University of Chicago in both the Divinity School and in the medical school, where I'm professor of religion and ethics. And my interest, of course, is in the parallels between earlier discussions, especially in the medieval period, and the ones we're having now on social media, as Ruth talked about. I'm a text scholar, so I'm interested in looking at text. And when you go looking at the actual texts that are being produced, whether they're visual or written texts, you'll see an interesting cooperation, or what's called the horseshoe effect, between the ultra left and the ultra right, which is fascinating and, of course, familiar. It's not only that we do not believe in science and we're rejecting science, and it's really unclear whether if Americans believe in anything, right? Any expertise, and I'm going to turn to that in just a moment. It's that we do believe in something else. It's not only we don't believe in nothing. We believe in medieval ideas. We're like very fond of feudal ideas, and this idea that we don't believe in science, but we believe in magic and alchemy, of course, has resonance for someone like me who studies early modern and late medieval periods. This notion that we've lost the sense that of causality and causality and the loss of trust and expertise is really fundamental to what we're experiencing now. So it's not only that you don't believe in fluoride, it's that you do believe in something like borax or hydrochloroquine or something. So that's really interesting to me. And people who fervently believe with a faith commitment in this alternative medicine, in this alternative vision, in this alternative universe in which they individually are the experts. And it's linked to my understanding that we've participated in bioethics to some extent by our deep focus coming out of the German idealist tradition, the deep focus on the self and on the ontological pursuit and our reification of autonomy in decision making, right? Now, when you have someone saying things like, well, this is my body, myself, which could have come right out of the mouth of of a left-wing journal, or this notion of I have to do my own research. I have done my own research. It centers the self in a very particular way, and honors that autonomous rule-making choice, which we theoretically wanted, right? Americans' views, for instance, in experts have collapsed across the board, not only in physicians, not only in scientists, but the CDC up in pre-pandemic. This, of course, was an effect of the pandemic. Almost 70% of Americans said they trusted the CDC. During the pandemic, it went down to 40% and below, and it has not recovered. And there's been a corresponding collapse in belief in vaccination. The share of U.S. kindergartners, for example, just an example, even for something like measles and polio, has gone down from 95% vaccination to really dipping below the 80%. So these statistics are really quite appalling. And as I said, it's across the board. It's clergy, it's even military. People have lost faith in the military. People have lost faith in police and firefighters. People have lost faith in politicians in massive ways. And what they have faith in, again, it's not that they don't have faith in anything. They have faith in a different kind of experts, and that's where Ruth's work comes in. And it's a tiny number of influences, or what are called super spreaders. The research shows that 2,000, a mere 2,000 or so super spreaders spread 80% of the content from fake news sites in a sample of more than 600,000 US voters on Twitter, on X. And these super spreaders were actually, turns out, likely to be women and older, my demographic, which is odd because you think of them as like basement dwelling teens or something, but they're not. And most people, 1 in 20 users in the data set followed at least one of these super serifs. So it's a small amount of people with a tremendous amount of reach. The other text I've turned my attention to is the vision, the right-wing vision that's been instantiated in the Project 2025 report. I'm not going to go into it here because we're doing brief introductions, and maybe Sally, you can lift up some of the ideas. But in that report, it is explicitly anti-expertise and calls out for the destruction of the CDC, the NIH, and the FDA explicitly, and calls out that in the name of saying we want to get rid of woke ideology. So the right wing attaching those institutions for being too left wing, the left wing attacking the same institutions for being right, so right wing authoritarian or anti-authoritarian, coming together in deeply anti-authoritarian moments in American history. This distrust is fundamental, and it is, because it's evocative of earlier moments of distrust, it's going to be very difficult to dislodge because it hooks into a long tradition of belief in paganism that's deeply seated and nearly fundamental to human persons. It's a belief in magic, and it's as opposed to belief in science, and it's going to be hard to shake that. So I'm really interested in thinking through how we might do that.
Thank you so much, Laurie. And, I think it's really fascinating. And as I've said on more than one occasion, I mean, as a historian myself by training, I think that one of the great powers of history is to kind of de-exceptionalize the present moment. I mean, we have this tendency to sort of, many of us at least, to kind of perceive that this loss of trust in institutions, we're at this, historically, I had even said it myself, this kind of historically unprecedented juncture in some ways, but in other ways, it's really just a return to baseline in terms of human societies. So if we want the equilibrium to be different, we might need to, have some rather radical and unusual interventions. So really looking forward to unpacking that. Dena, I'll turn to you now if you would like to join.
Sure. I used to teach at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Then I moved to Lehigh University, where I am, I guess, Emerita, president, endowed chair in health, and so on. So I've been kind of interested in this question of trust. And listening to Laurie, I guess I'm not clear that trust in science is as obvious as it ought to be. I mean, in one sense, sure, I'm, a huge fan of, vaccinations and so on. But I mean, to take I hope, fairly non-political example, everyone here, I think, has kids. And I think one of the things we did as, responsible parents was we tried to make very sure that our kids were not exposed to peanuts at an early age, because we were all absolutely convinced, myself included, that would, lead to a higher risk of peanut-related allergies. And this really rather brilliant young woman in Israel noticed, well, that's kind of weird, because her friends, who were genetically the same as the Jews she knew in the US, basically Ashkenazi Jews, they were feeding kids this thing. I don't know what it's called. It's sort of
It's called Bamba.
Thank you. And it's kind of like Cheerios. You see it everywhere. And kids are eating it from a very young age. It doesn't bother anybody. And the funny thing is that those kids were not getting peanut problems. And now we're told the absolute reverse. So part of that is just the way it was during the COVID pandemic, an understanding that science changes, and that knowing that science changes is part of, quote, trusting it. that it may be the best we've got, but that doesn't mean it is the best, that it might be 100% wrong, or it might be, you know, on its way to being better. So that's part of it. I wrote an article a month or so ago in which I talked about my difficulties, the impossibility of choosing wisely, and what everybody agrees is a correct medical result to get the medical care I needed without doing things I knew to be wrong, because I just absolutely had no choice. So I think we have to take that into account as well. You know, so it is to some extent, you know, as Laurie knows, I'm kind of an autonomy freak. So it doesn't surprise me that caring about your own experience is a very important piece of this. And looking at science with both, I don't know if trust is the right word, but, you know, trust, but also skepticism, I guess.
I think what I hear you to be saying, Dena, that I think is really interesting is that sometimes there is a tendency for us to present these series of dilemmas as kind of only a crisis, but I think that can also read sometimes as a sort of kind of self-pitying and kind of inaccurate representation of the fact that in some ways, you know, we need to grapple with scientists being epistemically humble and being able to communicate the limitations of their knowledge whilst also recognizing that science is very powerful. So I will, you know, start to unpack this in some of our questions, because I think we may unearth some interesting disagreements among the participants here. Arthur, finally, I'll just bring you in to introduce yourself and your area of focus, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Hi, I'm Art Caplan. I'm the head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU's Medical School, although you could be that soon enough because I announced my retirement as the head of the thing. I'm just going to become a professor, but I think they're still searching for a new head of the division. And I am going to concentrate on three topics. Laurie and Dena have kind of opened the door to the first one, which is been studying trust and the nature of what leads to trust in science. I've been writing about that past couple of years, even a little bit during the pandemic before things really went south. And I do think that while misinformation is a big problem worldwide, and disinformation, which is closer to what Ruth was over at, just lying and deceit, there's a big values problem out there too. It's partly what has been flagged already as overly worshipful of autonomy. But what I'm getting at more is if you look at the public health attacks from the MAGA people in the US or some in Europe, what you'll see is that they're wrapping themselves in that notion of freedom of choice or liberty. And that ethos is one in which I can decide for myself. I'm my own best judge. But basically, it's a crude version of what I thought was hilarious when I read it in high school, which was Ayn Rand. It's sort of this bananas egoism that has no sense of anybody else being around as important, or no sense of duty to others, or no sense that others form who you are. And if you add that to a freedom ethos, you got where we are in some sense relative to obsessive individualism that's selfish. So I think there's a role for bioethicists to go after that. Secondly, I'll comment at some point during this about bioethics failures, because I think there are some, one of which has been, many on the call know, and many in the audience undoubtedly know, that I've been a big believer in public bioethics, but I think it's still too neglected. It's been a failure, know-nothingism, and sort of unresponded to conservative opinions have been flying around out there, and I don't think we position the field well enough to engage. I'll give you a concrete example that's been driving me nuts lately. We have explicit eugenic racism touted by Trump in his campaign and earlier by the AfD in Germany, in Hungary, in a variety of places. We've had an ELSI program for about 25 years in the US. What's the point if you can't publicly condemn overt false eugenics? I mean, I didn't see much. Still haven't seen much. I tried to organize a meeting on eugenics in the middle of the Trump campaign. I didn't see anything else like it. So, to put it bluntly, if eugenics can flourish without response from bioethicists in a loud manner, that's not too good in my view. And lastly, how do we prepare for this? I'll just call it post-Trumpian, but it extends, as I said, there are certainly groups like the AfD in Germany. There are many others that are going to need preparation to do bioethics. And what might that be? And what I'm talking about there, give you one concrete example, is we believe in things like data transparency. Many of us have argued that you should keep your data public. In an age where people come out and subpoena you because you work on transgender, or you work on abortion, or you work on even Ruth's area of influencers and some conservatives screaming that it's censorship. Do you really want to keep your data easily accessible, or how do you best resist subpoenas and aggressive government actions to try and close down what you want to say? And I think that's coming. I already know it's coming. I've already engaged it, even at my own institution, when you bring up the idea, should we try to bring on more legal help for people who want to express opinions that the majority government may not like and may try to repress? And we have historical precedent, obviously, sadly, for that. I'll tell you what the response is for most of our academic homes. Keep your head down and don't draw attention. Don't be the target. I think that's ridiculous, but there it is. So we'll see if we can get into any of that stuff.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Arthur. Well, look, there's lots there. I can see lots of really interesting questions coming in from the participants elsewhere as well. So thank you for that. I apologize in advance if we don't get to them, but I will try my best. Okay, there's lots that I'd like to pick up on from these presentations, but I think I'd start with kind of dealing with this sort of fundamental tension in how we think about expertise, and this challenge in terms of how is it that the scientific community can communicate confidence in certain things, but also uncertainty in a way that doesn't undermine public trust. I guess what I'm saying is, how is it that we can balance epistemic humility with the need for authoritative guidance in medicine and public health? And I guess maybe the question to the panel is, has the scientific establishment done that well in recent years, or have there been notable failures?
So I want to pick up on this. I want to pick up on something that Dena said that is so important. So thank you, Dena. What's interesting about the attacks on science, or the attacks on medicine, or the attacks on or the mistrust, is within these texts of attack, there is some truth, there is reality, right? And that's really important for us to be humble enough to see, you know what, even with RFK, there's some stuff, yep, he's right about that processed foods. No, we might don't like the vaccine stuff, do like in the Project 2025 list of terrible things they plan to do, there's a lot of things that I would like. They want to have a bioethics commission. Yeah, we like that. They want greater transparency, right? They want people to tell the truth about things. They want greater transparency. They want to end conflict of interest. Many of these things are really admirable, right? So there's power in even in the critiques that you disagree with. And so to look across, as we say, the aisle in America because of how the Congress is set up, and to say, you know what, it's not, we can't just denounce this. It's crazy. We have to have some humility and say, yeah, like Art pointed out, we have failed on some critical aspects of the way we've structured our debates as well. And the right wing has picked up on some of those frailties and some of those errors, right? And so that's, I think, I can't speak I can't pretend I'm a right-wing person critiquing the left, but I'm a left-wing person critiquing the left, and a left-wing person critiquing our own practices is really useful, and having humility around that. I do think that beginning with understanding that there's, just as Dena said, that there's something to the critique of science that we have to listen to carefully and understand, because no, scientists have been far too bold in their claims. We've known this for a long time. They've hyped up their work, using words like, revolutionary and this will change everything, and we trot right along, and we have enabled that by turning our attention to these things and believing them, and also we've allowed them to say things that weren't true, and surrounded them with the protection of an ethics framework, even when, rightly so, in the beginning of the pandemic, the reason it went south so quickly was because scientists were not honest, saying we have no clue, we do not know, we don't know, and the whole confusion around masks, when what they meant to say was, we're afraid we're going to run out of stuff.
That's right. And I think that, Tony lied. And, before that, I was saying to everyone I knew, I know this guy, and if he told me to walk over a cliff, I'd walk over a cliff. And I was wrong.
Yeah.
And people, really very sane, grounded people, who never got over that, including my son. It's not like my son has gone crazy or anything, but that sense that he had, that somebody I knew and trusted and had all this, public glory around him, had deliberately lied. It just changed that he was never able to get back to.
I mean, just other panelists, do you really trust the CDC right now? I'm not entirely sure I trust their capacity, given the mess they made of COVID, that I agree with that. I agree they lied, right? And
Well, they certainly botched the presentation of vaccination around things like boosters. Nobody knows what's a booster in the world, and they failed to communicate adequately on a core thing about how many shots you need, when you need them. Do you need them annually? Is it a third shot? What the hell is it? I just wrote a paper about that, CDC failure. Generally, yeah, I do trust them, but I think they're lousy at communication. That's a key role for public health, is to be good communicators to the public. And I don't think they were or are even now particularly great. But I'll go in a different direction just to be mean. Ruth will know I go all the way back. My entry into bioethics came from philosophy of science, so I have bias about this question of trusting science. I'll put it this way. I don't think scientists know what science is. If I ask my medical students what's evidence, they will tell me what's published in the New England Journal or the Lancet. I'm not sure that's a good answer. We don't teach them about methods. We don't teach them about replication. We're all at institutions that have press releases weekly that say they've cured the last disease, whatever it is they're doing. It's a ton of hype. We spin it. It gets into the literature in a way. I mean, the media, both legacy and influencer media that Ruth was talking about. So just as a point, without a clear understanding of the fallibility of science, without a clear understanding of the role that falsification and replication play, I don't think scientists explain much of what they do. And if you ask me, Laurie, you know what I think CDC does? It uses the old model of we're the authorities, and we don't explain anything. We just tell you, put on a mask, get quarantined, whatever recommendation they want to make. And there's not a lot of, and this is why we think it, or these are our doubts, or these are our hesitancies, or better to do this than not do anything because we don't know what we're doing or yet, or whatever. So I think there's a philosophy of science failure.
But I think there's kind of an interesting distinction in the question Laurie was asking, or what you're saying, Art, which is, is this about competence in terms of using the levers of communication, or is there a kind of fundamental lack of good faith in the way some of this stuff is communicated. Those are sort of quite different things. And now, I mean, one interpretation of what's happened, and I'll be interested to hear the panel's take on this, is, you know, as a sociological phenomenon, you see in a world where politics is less polarized, you know, there's more capacity for scientists to kind of be open about epistemic limitations. But in an environment where, you know, any sort of chink is going to be weaponized, you're going to sort of self-censor, you're possibly more vulnerable to kind of politicizing your own findings for the sake of kind of protecting, you know, what you perceive to be the politically right environment. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is, I guess the question becomes, you know, is the real issue that science has become politicized unduly, or is it rather that science and medicine has failed to acknowledge its inherently political nature? And kind of, would we be better served by openly discussing kind of values and politics within scientific institutions with the public? I'd be curious for the panel's take on any of that.
So Sally, you said that, you know, because we are, you know, increasingly polarized and politicized and all those words, that it's harder. But, you know, when I look back at things like the 50s, which, you know, I understand were supposedly much calmer and less politicized and so on. But you get that whole thing from all the, what was it? Dr. Welby and all those other things where the doctor's always right. Patients who, you know, flout what the doctor says always get into trouble because they're always wrong. And there's a general thing, and we have odd kind of words like doctor's orders, as if somehow that's different than other people in my life who, you know, might give me orders as well, right? But somehow doctor's orders, well, then you just absolutely got to do that. So I think in a way, I mean, maybe we've gone too far, or maybe we've gone in the wrong direction. But I think that there was a unhealthy dependency on medicine in a less polarized piece of time.
I mean, it's interesting because even though this is framed as a crisis of trust and expertise, even in the meetup today, I mean, you can also see it in terms of a democratization of knowledge. And I guess the challenge for us is kind of, what's the difference between destructive challenges to scientific authority and constructive challenges to scientific authority? And are there models of what that looks like in practice?
Well, it's not that we don't trust expertise. And this is one of the questions was, what is this more than an American phenomena? And absolutely is more than an American phenomena. One of the glories on X, obsessively as I am, is that you hear from people all over the world about a similar phenomena happening, right? So in the UK, a place that I know something about, Sally, of course, you could say much more about this. There was the same mistrust of authority, mistrust of what was going on in the pandemic. The exact same thing happened in France, of course. The same thing as well. And so you could see this happening. Romania, a classic case of Romania with the leading Romanian candidate, like believing in some sort of weird mystical, I said paganism before, sort of mystical alliance with nature as his way to cure your immune system. So it happened all over the world, whatever this phenomena was. And again, my theory is it wasn't the distrust of experts, it's the distrust of a certain kind of an expert, and the weird trust on magicians. Or on, and Dena is right that it's because there's something to that. There's something that we participated in the deconstruction of expertise and paternalism, but the zeitgeist has clearly flipped around this.
But it's also since Laurie said I was right, that's I mean, so there's a book, what's it called? The Breast Cancer Wars. It's been around for a while now. And it was about the period of time in the 60s when people were really fighting about things like, whether radical mastectomies were what every single woman needed if she had breast cancer. And it's still an interesting book, but reading that book, what really struck me was that there were two sides to this question. Everybody wanted the women to do as well as they could. I mean, nobody was in bad faith there, but there were two kinds of people. There were doctors who got their hands in people's bodies and followed these women and were very happy when they survived and unhappy when they didn't, and for whom each of these women had a name. And then there were a bunch of statisticians who didn't have a whole lot of medical knowledge and didn't get their hands in people's bodies and might not have been, in medical schools at all. And they were saying, well, look, you may think this because of this woman, but the reality is, I mean, from my perspective, that's the reality, right? The reality is that statistically, that doesn't work. Statistically, it's just as good to do lumpectomies, for example. So there was this, big notion of what is knowledge. And there were these surgeons saying, you can't tell me what knowledge is. I was there. I had my hands in a woman's body and she died. And don't tell me this. And then there are statisticians who say, well, you're not looking at the big picture. And I think, we might call it, I don't want to call it paganism, but that sense that my personal experience is what counts is, I think, connected to that notion that Laurie is talking about.
Now, these examples that everybody's giving are really good examples, but they're primarily examples of what people who are either well-trained, they're professionals, they're working in the field, they may be in different aspects of the field. And so the experts are debating with one another. And maybe they're not all totally experts, but they're people who work in the fields. My perception, though, is that there's a radical difference between experts in the past, or even in the present, of course, debating with each other, which still exists among experts, and total non-experts, the people that Laurie was talking about, and everybody who is just wants to put their hand in it or their mouth in it in social media, for example. So there's, it seems to me, a growth in beliefs of things that are perpetrated by quote unquote non-experts. And what I mean is non-experts, they're not scientists, they're not and just to take a look at how this has occurred in the United States, for those of us who live in the United States, the very fact that the people who are being nominated or chosen by Trump to head these organizations have no expertise whatever, but they have their beliefs. I mean, RFK Jr. is a perfect example. I mean, he's a lawyer and he's going to be the head of the NIH. I mean,
of course, the HHS.
So, yeah, yes, right.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that there's a difference in kind, in a way, from the kinds of debates that occurred in the past between people from the CDC or, different areas of government and what's going on today, because there are a lot of obviously naive citizens who have come to believe all these things. And probably the best single example is probably the vaccination example, but I'm sure there are others.
But I think it's very interesting, Ruth, because something that's emerged from the conversation is, whilst of course, some of these beliefs are wrong, it's potentially dangerous to sort of label people who believe them as naive or to criticize them. I mean, I think one of the things I'd like to get the panel's view on is kind of, this idea that some people have put forward, not just from the right, actually, that concerns about misinformation are in some ways reflections of elite anxiety about losing control of the information landscape. So I guess it's this, and, for example, in Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook founder and CEO's interview with Joe Rogan recently, he had this whole kind of riff on the repopulation of cultural elites caused by social media. And so I guess I was interested, we've got to find ways, I guess, to distinguish between legitimate concerns about misinformation and what might be perceived as kind of paternalistic attempts to control public discourse to our liking. I'm curious for the panel's view on, I guess, the relationship between expertise and elitism.
Two things spring to mind. One is that it's not only an attack on elites, the next thing we're going to see is an attack on our universities,
Oh,
right? And the funding and training of our students and the next class of elites, and a privileging of a certain kind of discourse that's going to be very, very difficult to get beyond. And because to some extent, again, we have been elite. These are university elite. These universities do train elites. There has been a disdain for working class people. There has been a privileging of certain ideas. My favorite example is when we on the left decided that the right term was Latinx for people of Hispanic heritage, and like no one wanted that. That was ridiculous, and like we could have had it in our books and everything. So that's a classic example, and I could give you hundreds of others of errors we've made in exactly that way. We are elite. It is elite. Many of us, I know, because I know you all personally, and then I know many of us, we're not born to this and clawed our way up through the educational system. We're like, with immigrant parents, and not my grandparents didn't even speak English, right? So it was like, yeah, but we're here and we're in it, and we became elites, and we participate, and we get the benefits of it. And something about
what do you mean by elite? I mean,
yeah,
one obvious example is Vance, who, was it Yale he went to? And,
yeah.
So he's like, oh, I'm not elite, but obviously he went to Yale Law School,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. But someone, who's a little less crazy, like David Brooks, he's like, well, I'm elite. Well, of course you're elite. You're writing for the New York Times, and you went to school wherever you went to school, and you want me to read you because you have good things to. I don't get this elite business. I just literally don't understand.
It's
And I
classic.
want the elite person running the CDC, if that's what elite means.
Right. It's a classic Andrew Jackson kind of thing. And like we're about to have a Secretary of Defense that doesn't know who our allies' names in Aeon in the
Right.
alliance. So it's widespread. It's not just healthcare. And why this, by the way, is particularly terrifying is I don't know. Like, is anyone in charge of H5N1 globally, locally? We don't know. We could really face significant new pandemics with no with no trained leadership, which is really quite terrifying. So yes, we believe in expertise, but the trouble is that belief that the more education you have, the more you would actually know something about the world has been challenged, and successfully challenged, as Sally points out, and as Ruth points out,
I mean, I think one of the uncomfortable things is what I'm hearing is there needs to be some sort of reckoning of the mistakes as a way of moving forward into sort of some new social contract, if you will, around exactly, what the role of experts is. But of course, that's a very uncomfortable place for any kind of institution or set of experts to be in, especially when they feel that's going to immediately give fodder to, bad faith critics. So, yeah, it's a really challenging situation. I think I'm going to try and bring in some of the questions from the audience because there's a lot of interest. I mean, I was particularly interested, Laurie, in this point about, when we often talk about disinformation, about distrust and not believing in things, but you're framing it in a different way around what we do believe in. So I wonder if you could just unpack this connection between this sort of sociocultural phenomenon that we're discussing and paganism and these kind of deeper roots in certain forms of religious thought.
So the enduring idea of paganism, which is really attractive to both the left and to the right, is this notion that things left in nature are good, that nature has a moral valence, right? Now, of course, in classic Judaism, nature is morally neutral, and human beings are the thing that change it. But in paganism, it's that no, there's a spirit in the world, and so the whole cascade of argument about don't touch, my immune system has to be left free in some way. That getting sick will strengthen my immune system. That's a jumbled up idea, has to do with this notion that nature is that you can trust nature, the natural world, right? Because it has a spirit that's actually good. Gaia on the left, right? And a kind of attachment to folk things on the right. In America, this takes some very interesting forms. The single most popular television program in America is Yellowstone, which is a reification of the myth of the West, cowboys, real Indians. And there's some interesting twists within it. We could do a whole session on the ethics of Yellowstone, why it's the most popular show and how that plays out, but and how medicine is seen and abortion is seen in that show. But we're not going to do that. But we can say that, you know, in this attachment to the vogue, to the popular, that's a very deeply held belief that wisdom comes from the simple. And there's an entire structure of internet life, which is returning to trad wife, returning to the simple, returning to the past, that the past holds the secret of true wisdom. Those are all beliefs that were very, very widespread throughout the medieval period, of course, when paganism had a strong voice, and even Christianity was flavored with these kind of ideas. So I think those are ones we look at: the belief in magic, the fear, the sort of turning to strong, divinely connected figures. We saw in the worship of Trump as if he was divinely protected, is that kind of a belief that the bullet missed his head because he was selected by God to be the anointed one, to be the king. That you see, that's a kind of a reoccurrent belief. You're a historian, Sally, so you know what I'm seeing here when I see these.
You know, I'm cracking up because it just occurred to me, Sally, I haven't met you, but everyone else on this panel is at least culturally and historically Jewish, and which it hadn't occurred to me before. And so another piece that fits into it is natural law. And you see that occasionally in people like Cass, but for the most part, it's more of a Christian notion.
So just to jump in there on
into this, and no surprise, anti-Semitism, a very, very popular belief of within that feudal tradition, within feudalism, raises its head not to some extent because of geopolitics, but to some extent because it's the thing you think in a feudal idea. You've got a set of feudal ideas.
I was just going to jump in and say, you can't underestimate the cultural fallout of a deadly pandemic. If you look at them historically, they cause panic. They cause people to revert to religious faith. They cause people to look for mighty leaders to work them out of. There's promulgation of misinformation and disinformation, not as fast as on the social media outlets, but the Jews brought about the bubonic plague, and on it goes on and on. It's all over the place. And we will live in a post-pandemic distrust era because science didn't save us. It failed.
Right.
We had a lot of deaths and a lot of trouble and a lot of shutdowns and a lot of schools closed and a lot of people got locked up in China and Australia and US and who knows where. That's a legacy. And so part of what we're wrestling with is rationality's response to panic, if you want to put it that way. And then I want to get concrete again, just to mention something that we could control but didn't. And I come back to it. In Germany, let's talk the AfD. It is a racist, eugenicist, proudly anti-immigrant, bigoted party that is now, I think, second in popularity in the German legislature. It has been growing and growing in power. You could see movements established like it in Hungary. And you certainly can see racist eugenics in play in Myanmar, partly in the Middle Eastern conflict. So just a concrete question to try and be specific, where is 30 years of ethics investment in bioethics and genetics relative to these movements? I mean, I don't really care what ethicists have to say about making sure that, people have informed consent to their genetic testing if we can't mount a response to a political movement that says, well, what we should do is just deport everybody who's racially inferior and threatens the genetic health of the Volk.
Right.
I mean, really?
Right.
We have nothing?
Right.
No organized response, and we don't urge our science friends to speak up? And I just mentioned this because this is within our control. I'm always a little, I don't know what the hell we're going to do about social media. I'll wait for Ruth to tell me. But I mean, I don't know. And I'm not sure what we're going to do about panic in terms of distrust because everybody really got damaged goods around the world. But really, the reoccurrence of eugenics with no bioethics commentary in a vocal, organized, systematic, day after day engagement?
So what do you think accounts for that lack of a response, Art, in terms of why hasn't there been an organized response to the sort of reemergence of this toxic discourse?
Well, I'll really go provocative here and say two things. One, the people who created the funding in the US and in other countries to do the ethics swore off two things. They would never do germline genetic engineering, and they were obviously anti-eugenic. So they wanted ethics to accompany the movement of genetic science into medicine at the bedside, and they were happy to support that, even if politically they didn't make any provision. I mean, as I said, they swore off germline. There is some discussion in bioethics about that, but I never believed it to be true. It's ridiculous to swear off germline therapy. Who would ever? But that was the founding premise, at least in the US, of the ELSI program. The other reason I think there hasn't been a response is that the bioethicists are, in my opinion, too much at the bedside. There are important problems here, and I understand that. But in terms of public health, eugenics, mass movements, what's going on internationally, that isn't where our jobs are. If I write papers decrying eugenics, my clinical colleagues in the medical school, who I love, but they don't care. That's not their jobs, and it's not where the rewards are.
So let me just say this one thing. It's like I think bioethics is faltered in the COVID pandemic as well. I don't think we did such a great job in the COVID pandemic as well. I think we were too silent, we were too absent, we didn't really make cases that we should have made. That being said, it's not just healthcare, it's climate change. Like the denial really is very profound in climate change. I was saying before, I wrote an entire book on climate change, the ethics of climate change, and every scientist in the world standing up and saying, this is coming, this is coming. And quite frankly, I couldn't convince my own family not to eat meat and to sell the house in Los Angeles, right? Whoops. And so there's this massive sense of denial around climate change, around what deep confusion about what to do, and lots of conflicting messages, and a robust anti-science industry, basically backed by real industry, but a sub-industry in denying the reality of climate change. And we too participate, living our little bioethics lives as if climate change isn't as urgent and real as we all know it to be. So because we learn the habits of denial as well, and the habits of rejection of some things we don't like. I still wear a mask in enclosed spaces and on airplanes. I'm always the only one. Right. And that's like, wait a minute, listen, people, mass work, we should work. But no, right. So we all
But you don't have a place on Fox News, do you?
I do not have
I mean, that is the biggest influencer, public influencer in this country. Right. So the few bioethicists, I mean, I wonder about the percentage of people who are academic bioethicists who are influencers on Fox News, when you think of what the connection is between the politics and the views that the public has.
I mean, actually, Ruth, I'd like to bring you in here because I'd like to raise explicitly this question of kind of social media and the extent to which it's kind of a causal driver of what's happening. I mean, I think taking something very tangible that's happened recently, what do you think about the implications of social media companies kind of standing down fact checkers and relying on this kind of community moderation as a way, their argument being, again, to sort of quote Zuckerberg from the Rogan interview, is he's like, well, this is good because it's about giving people more information and more context. It's just, we're not going to do what the Biden administration said we had to, which was pretend vaccines had no side effects. We're just going to let people comment. What do you make of this kind of shift and its implications for disinformation.
They want to be on the right side of the incoming president. They don't want things to be shut down. They don't want the power of this irrational forthcoming president. So the people who are, I mean, I'm thinking probably the leading example just from today's news, yesterday and today, is Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no better example of someone who was kind of a left-wing guy and took some left-wing views and ran this huge company. And now he wears a watch that costs $80,000 or $100,000. And he went from being a slightly lefty guy who was very creative in his early life now to be giving $1 million, obviously, to the party that's going to be held on Monday.
I guess what I'm resisting here, though, just to push you a bit on this, Ruth, is, you know, I mean, I think both Laurie and Dena, you've kind of talked about this necessity to sort of be nuanced in terms of how experts talk about their missteps. And I mean, similarly, I think you could have, there is an argument that one could make, and again, I'm not saying I personally agree with this, but you could say, okay, Zuckerberg, clearly he wants the MAGA rebrand, and clearly he wants to be on the right side of the Trump administration, but is he taking a defensible decision for the wrong reasons? So I think I'm just interested in probing sort of, does the panel unilaterally condemn the, you know, standing down of fact checking, or is there an opportunity here to sort of do some sort of collaborative community discussion and get people bought in to, you know, feeling like they're stakeholders in discerning truth in a positive way? I mean, again, I can say, you know, this is kind of the approach that Musk has taken on Twitter. So yeah, I'm curious, I guess, to hear about what does the panel think about the fate of fact checking in the context of social media?
Dead.
Dead, you said?
Dead.
Dead, right. You know what it's like, what Twitter is like? It's like being on you know, in a public park or public beach in California, and like you're having a discussion, your friends are there, and then like crazy people keep running around, like naked crazy guys run through, and then some other right-wing person comes through with a megaphone, and you can't, you just have to sort of sort your way through it. And it is really distracting. It is really difficult. I'm not sure if it's free speech. I don't know what it means, but it is a public space. We think of it because it comes on our screens as if it's information, as if it can be curated, right? And we want it curated. I want to look over and point to the guy with the megaphone saying, that's not true what he's saying. That's not true. And here's Ruth actually bringing up the point of there's evildoers, but there's evildoers in the public park too. And so it does recapitulate a different sort of social space. I'm thinking of Hannah Arendt here when she talks about the space of appearance, the importance of a public square, and that the only thing you can do is hope that the space of appearance is preserved and that you make a good argument. And that's the minimal conditions for a democracy, a demos.
I mean, one of the challenges is that, you know, the architecture of the space also determines the sorts of discourses that get surfaced. And of course, in an economy where attention is the thing that earns the company's money, then of course the things that the algorithm will elevate are going to be things that tap into sort of primal emotions that gather people's attention. So there's much more I could say on this, and I'm conscious that we've even been talking an hour, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. But Ruth, was there anything else kind of you wanted to add about you know, the role of social media in this? Is it unremittingly bad, or is there anything, I guess my question about sort of trying to see the silver lining in this is like, is there anything that can be salvaged in terms of kind of rebuilding trust in this new information landscape?
Well, I mean, if I were writing a paper on this, I would have to give a lot of reasons, right, and a lot of justification. But I am neither a user of or an admirer of social media. I don't see how so many intelligent people can waste their time reading all those things that other people say. I see someone's applauding here. But I mean, and I mean among intelligent people and not just so-called elites, people who read all those things and respond to all those things. I mean, don't they have anything better to do? Read a novel. You know, it's a little more fun.
Read our books. We're experts, right?
So, I mean, it's really hard to understand. I mean, I'm probably the oldest person here, right? I've lived for almost 87 years, and I see a very big difference and from my youth, my young age, my middle age to now in the way people talk, in the just even, let's take a silly example, which is the use of swear words that are now in everybody's vocabulary and are now permitted on programs on public media, where they were absolutely forbidden for so many years. So I don't want to use a fancy word like the decline of civilization, but things have certainly gotten pretty raw compared to I don't know, the politeness that I saw when I grew up. And I'm not a prude. I'm not at all a prude, but this is a difference, and it apparently is all over the world. Now, one thing we didn't cover, and I just want to bring it up just as a reminder, is that a lot of the arguments that one sees and he reads about in the United States is freedom of speech and the constitutional protection. And other countries have begun actually to put more constraints on social media because they don't have that particular constitutional provision. So, and some of the reading that I've done recently, and I haven't delved into the social, I mean, into the one about the amendments to the Constitution, but there are some people who are saying, yes, there are some ways of being able to control speech, even though we have allegedly have free speech in this country. So maybe that's something to look at and see what legitimate ways there might be that aren't going to shut everybody up, but that really will bring a little more sense to the discussions that go on in the public media.
I mean, I wonder if in some ways this comes back to Laurie and Dena's discussion of autonomy. And of course, I mean, autonomy itself can be a contested term because when we think about autonomy, we typically think of it in terms of this liberal notion of autonomy, of the sovereign self, the rational chooser, and so forth. But there are lots of other notions of autonomy we could draw on around, like relational autonomy and the way that we can find opportunities for growth through our relationships with others. So, you know, I do sometimes wonder if kind of the conversation around free speech does sort of, you know, there are ways we can defend autonomy that don't require us to sort of have this radically individualistic view. And indeed, you know, the irony with some of the anti-vaxxer skepticism, and I think it's very interesting, Laurie, how you point out that some of these forms of skepticism really don't sit comfortably within a traditional political orientation. And indeed, you know, you see the sort of on the people on the far left who you would expect to be sort of communitarian in orientation, in actually being anti-vaxxer, you're sort of reifying this highly individualized notion of like, well, this is my choice for my family, and you're not really conceptualizing the fact you're choosing not to be vaccinated in terms of its implications for the community. So it's actually
Sally, let me just jump in there because I meant to say this and it just reinforces something you're saying. If you buy into the problem as just information and correcting misinformation, you're still buying into the idea that it's my choice.
Right.
And so, you know, if it's just information, then I can still act like an idiot if I choose relative to better information. So I don't think the solution here is just correcting misinformation or disinformation, not that I oppose it, but as you're starting to say, you have to go further in terms of the moral responsibilities that go along with making decisions, whether they impact others or lead to abuse of children in the way Ruth is worrying about. And those are moral. They're not just informational.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it does also tie up with kind of, you know, people's self-conception as belonging to a certain group and then certain positions with respect to, you know, science or medicine become tied up with an identity category. And so maybe, you know, it's not just about misinformation, but it's dealing with these kind of humans' deeper drive for kind of meaning and belonging. I just want to pick up on a couple of things. One thing that's come up, but from a couple of participants, is this question of science as a self-correcting process, and the fact that, you know, and again, this ties in with what several of you have been saying about the kind of triumphalism, the necessity for universities to kind of win in this attentional economy by using these bombastic press releases. This doesn't help, obviously. It doesn't kind of accurately show what science is about, which is indeed it's actually right and proper that scientists get things wrong and then we figure it out and then, we improve. So is there something to be said in kind of going to this next level of sort of how can we participate in a public discussion about what science is? Would that be helpful, or is this just too far removed from what you're talking about art as kind of needing to sort of address some of ththese deeper challenges?
Well, isn't there something to be said here for really early education for, elementary and secondary, that, you learn that doing an experiment with a negative result gives you information as well. It doesn't mean you failed. You found out useful stuff. This whole notion that science is an ongoing thing, and that faced with something as novel as a new epidemic, it's going to get things wrong, right? And if we all understood that, but somehow kids don't seem to be learning that anymore, or most of
But one little program that we launched here at NYU, it's probably in its third year now, little sign of hope as we wrap up. It's called Give One Talk, and we're trying to get every NYU medical student, nursing student, public health, and others to go and give one talk in the community about what they work on as scientists or doctors. And partly it's to make people understand that we come out of the ivory tower. Partly it's to make people relate to young scientists as opposed to authoritarian, expert, older scientists. Sorry, Tony. And at the same time, get questions about what is science, force them to explain what do they do, why do they believe it. I'm talking about the students. So I think there are efforts we could make. I'll mention one other thing. We have a high school bioethics program that we've run, I don't know, 15 years. It's probably the least funded thing I ever did, but I believe it's the right thing to do. You should engage young people. They're very interested in all these questions, and bioethics does not go there. I'll just put it that way. Enough. It doesn't go there.
I do have one of those underfunded, unfunded projects, which is to work with the Chicago Labor Council, the AFL-CIO in Chicago, and put scientists and trade union members together in a discussion. Like, no one wants to fund this idea, but I think it's a great idea that you would have this. But the trust is it's much more than science. It began with this notion that homeschooling your kid was better than public school, or that no one knew how to run a public school but the parents, right? And this revolution in the challenging of school boards, which is some of the impulse of the MAGA movement. It was these women who wanted to run for who didn't like their public education, because public education per se is seen as problematic. Again, because it's this anti-communitarian, it's this notion just for me. It's why Americans have guns. People have
but
American
if you look,
guns
Laurie,
to defend themselves from other Americans. It's crazy, right?
You look
Right.
at where some of the worst anti-vax people are, they're in Waldorf schools.
Yes.
And, it's true. Waldorf schools, which are communitarian and very left-wing and so on and so forth. And that's where you get one year my kid was the only vax kid in the whole school, thank God.
But I think to your point, Laurie, I mean, even critiques of public institutions like schools, I mean, there's a lot to be said for sort of criticisms about how education is delivered, but that then it then bleeds over into this generalized critique of the concept of public education, and we need to find ways of sort of disaggregating the legitimate critiques from the spillover kind of damaging and corrosive ones. But that feels very vulnerable for people when you feel like you're just in a defensive posture, even trying to kind of protect certain things like medicine, science, public schools, so it's almost like we need these different spaces where you can have a kind of, a true reckoning of the challenges, but then you also need to be able to present the overall argument for the legitimacy of these institutions in general.
Hey, Sally, I have a question for the panel. Does anybody think in any program around the world in bioethics that anybody striving for promotion or tenure gets rewarded for showing a policy impact or the ability to influence public debate?
Yeah, I think there's.
Ruth's laughing.
Ruth is laughing.
I mean, I don't.
We have all, we have the Marty Center at University of Chicago that celebrates the public understanding of religion and does religion and science stuff. So there's little flurries of it. But you're right, our focus has been where we've been paid to be.
Exactly.
And we've not
And
been.
the culture sets the rewards, which is in that, let's say, medical and health setting, frequently publication, frequently being good advisors to other health professionals. I've sat on a lot of promotion committees, not as long as Ruth, but pretty long.
Yeah.
No one has ever mentioned, oh, look, and they write a lot of op-eds, or they're out in the community doing talks, or they've influenced a legal accomplishment about something. Never.
And indeed, that can be perceived with actual skepticism by, other experts. So, I mean, I think what you're saying, right, is that one, if we're going back to the core question of this discussion, which is about, disinformation and trust in healthcare, maybe some of the factors are actually less sociological and they're more kind of institutional and looking at the incentives about how scientific research happens, how universities work. And so part of the solution is actually getting to that level, even if it's a couple of degrees removed from, the ultimate problem we're addressing.
Law schools do this all the time. It's no surprise at all. So it's not, impossible in the academic situation. Depends what you care about.
It's also, it can't be one way or it's not going to work. It can't be like we experts tell them why science is wonderful and great and they should believe us. I mean, because we saw that with Tony Fauci, right? Exactly. Look, believe me, trust me. But we don't know, we in the universities know very little about what work is like, what actual work is like. So that's why the trade union thing is so interesting to me, as opposed to the high school one. The high school ones, which I've done too, still we're the experts and they're the kids, they're the students. But in a situation in which we scientists have to be humbled and learn something about what it is to be a minor in this country. And of course, as a historian, I think of Humphrey Davy, and Sally will know who I'm talking about because he's a UK hero of mine of the UK, who went into the mines because the miners, he figured out about gases very early on, head of the First Royal Society in Britain, and the miners came to him and said, our mines are collapsing and come and fix it. And he went 3 miles down, and there's great sort of drawings of him down there with the miners, learning about what it was to be a miner and coming up with the Davies lamp, which probably the single most important technological invention of the 20th century, right? 19th and 20th century, saved millions of lives all over the world because he had learned from the miners what it was like, what they needed. So there's that notion of learning why people are so unhappy and why people are so angry and why people are so mistrustful from people themselves, and we need to learn about that work is of critical importance, I think, too.
Yeah, I think this is a really lovely note on which to end. I mean, I think that one of the takeaways from this discussion is, we can't start rebuilding trust until we conceptualize it in a kind of it's a two-way street. So, we can't sort of disparage communities. We can't disparage people's beliefs. We have to very first kind of be curious about it and, try and sort of revive this conversation and learn from people rather than conceptualizing scientific communication as kind of, we go away, we do the research, and then we communicate it outwards. I mean, I know several of you on the panel will agree with that. I apologize to all of the participants. The questions and the comments have been incredibly interesting, and the panelists will I'm sure have a look and would be very interested to hear from you. So it's been a really fascinating conversation that I've been very grateful to be a part of. So thank you all for your attention and your interest. I hope that these conversations can continue elsewhere and that things start to look a little bit rosier in the future as a result of some of these changes. So thanks to everybody for being here, and looking forward to seeing some of you at the next meetup.
So good to see you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right. Really wonderful questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for the comments.
Very smart questions from the people listening. Yeah.